in undergrad.
You're not weird, trust me.
Well, no, I just had so many friends in undergrad who came from different parts of Africa, but was able to sort of have, insofar as there was a common kind of tongue, they all spoke some version.
They all spoke Swahili.
And I always ended up feeling so left out of those conversations. And it's such a, I mean, I guess everyone says this about every language, but to me, there was just something so beautiful about it.
Oh my goodness, you're preaching to the choir.
And so I was, and so the German thing, only because I have a fair amount of connections with people in Germany, and for some reason I got the impression that German and English are not so far from each other. English is like a Germanic language.
It is,
And I traditionally have had a lot of difficulty with languages. It's just never. I mean, I took 4 years of Spanish. And I was terrible.
Oh no!
And then when I was in Korea, we'll talk about it, I sort of started learning Korean, and that was actually as much progress as I've made in languages. But it's because Korean is very scientific. It's very structured, and you just kind of learn the rules, and you kind of know it.
There's not a lot of exceptions.
Right. So it's not English in the sense
that there's like 16 ways to pronounce F.
No sense.
Yeah.
So it's very structured, and so I learned actually how to read it relatively.
Cool.
Easy.
Awesome.
I couldn't speak to save my life. And in fact, there are all these really hilarious stories of me in the supermarket trying to order food and just completely clueless. And I would always be rescued by these sort of 12 to 14-year-old kids who were learning English. I wanted to speak to a native English. They acted as my translator.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
That's so cool. I'm so glad that you're learning Swahili. Now, I'm Kenyan. I'm half Kenyan. So I lived in Kenya for 10 years.
Oh, wow.
And
how was that experience?
Oh, my goodness. I mean, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to live there. It really defined who I am today. It exposed me to a whole lot of different perspectives. People in Kenya are really resourceful. A lot of people don't have as much as people in the United States have, so we know how to make things last really long. And you really see how much a dollar is worth when you're hanging around with people who make $5 a day. So I mean, that for me was, my goodness. And then people are very, very authentic. Sometimes I feel like when you have less access to things, you kind of are more confident in what you know. And I mean, the food, the climate, those are just amazing. The music, the language, Swahili I'm very, very passionate about. I was doing a couple of lessons on Duolingo before you got here. And one of the things I really love about Duolingo is that they do a pretty good job of making it relevant. And I'm not sure if you know this. Have you ever been to East Africa?
I have not. So my it's one of the great I would say gaps insofar as my traveling. So I've had several invitations to go to South Africa for different conferences. And one reason or another, I never made it there. And in particular, when they were having the World Cup, I was determined to make it.
You were determined.
I could just enjoy that experience of having a World Cup in Africa. And at the end, it just didn't work out. And so I have, as I was saying, I have a lot of friends. From East Africa, Tanzania, and sort of those countries on the Horn, and so I've been invited to weddings there, which I've heard is sort of the thing to do. And for again, just one reason or another,
couldn't make it. That's so
it's such a gap, I would say, but it's gonna be rectified in short order. I'm sure.
This brings me into something that I really want to talk to you about. Truthfully, I would say that you might even look more Kenyan than me.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, so I'm, I had this ancestry. It must have been ancestry or something.
You done it?
And so I'm like West African. It turns out, like Togo.
Okay, cool.
A little bit of like Cote d'Ivoire and all of that. but people, would just start speaking in various African languages to me.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, that sounds amazing. I really wish I knew what you just said.
Like,
to me.
your heart is there, but you don't understand.
My brain is just not able to make those connections.
Okay, cool.
So I'm from, I'm from the South Caribbean. I was born there, Grenada, relatively small island. It's affectionately known as Reagan's Great Triumph.
Reagan's Great Triumph.
Yeah, it's
Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, kind of tongue in cheek. So, in about 1979. So, the history of the island goes that it flipped from British to French rule several times over the years. It was first discovered, in quotes, by Columbus in his initial voyage to these shores.
Yeah.
And he never actually landed on the island, but he ended up naming it Grenada after Granada in Spain.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know if that was a slip of tongue or what, or if he just tried to call
Granada in Spain,
Granada is a sort of
where is that?
It's I believe it's on the west coast of Spain.
It's a
city in Spain.
Cool.
But it's with an A, so it's Granada.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure if the Grenada thing came because of something lost in translation, or if he was like most of the time just naming things new Granada or whatever the case is. Anyway, so Grenada stuck. So he never set foot on the island, but he purportedly smelled the spices that was coming off of it, and so
it's not possible.
Yeah. So it became known as the Spice Island for that reason.
Cool.
Until this day, it's sort of known as the Spice Island. And a little factoid. Country's about 120 square miles, so if you will, 11 by 11.
That's where you're
it's a lot longer than it is wide, thankfully. Super volcanic, but it's probably still, at least this was what we were taught growing up, that it's the world's number 2 producer of nutmeg.
Okay.
So that's hence the spices that Columbus found.
Yeah.
Turns out that nutmeg is this really, really finicky plant that can really only grow in this very, very, very tight band around the equator. And Grenada lies right on that band. And the other country that does it is Indonesia.
Oh.
So it's kind of the second, but it's a distant second. So Indonesia has like 90% market share.
Yeah.
And Grenada maybe has like 7.
Okay.
It's number 2.
I mean.
So, but it's this wonderful, wonderful place. Volcanic, great beaches, really beautiful kind of landscape, but even more beautiful people. It gets cliched a lot that, island folk are these kind of friendly, kind of thing. But it's really, really true there.
I'll take that positive stereotype.
It's fantastic. It's
like being friendly. Sure. Yes, please.
Yeah, friendly and, sort of pretty engaging. Sort of. There were, of course, like I said, quote unquote, discovered by Columbus, because, of course, there were people living there before. Carib people, Taino peoples, basically, who sort of came from South America and were just sort of pursuing another tribe who sort of moved up to the Bahamas at that time. And so they were just pursuing them. And so they colonized a lot of the islands up the Caribbean chain.
Yeah.
When the when the Europeans showed up, then those people were there. And of course, it's as what happens when you have a class of civilization, you tend to, the indigenous people tend to bear the brunt of that.
They get wiped out. Yeah.
But the islands in general, in the Caribbean islands, Caribbean from the Caribs, supposedly, so those people that they were named after.
I didn't even know that. Thank you.
And
my knowledge of the Caribbean is very lacking. Yeah. So I'm soaking up all of this.
It's a fascinating history, and there are these really, really amazing books that were written about sort of the early days and what happened, and the islands, because again they're in this sort of equatorial band right next to the equator, and tend to be volcanic and also very fertile, and so they became very good at growing some of these crops, tobacco and cotton and sugarcane, that were very important as cash crops for the Europeans. And so
Yeah.
it ended up becoming these overseas territories that then needed to be staffed because the local people.
So people were just enslaved, or pretty much.
So then they realized that you can sort of have a pretty lucrative economy if you didn't pay the people who.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So.
Oh wow! Surprise! They realize there's profit here. Dang, that's sad.
And but so a lot of people from West Africa were brought in to effectively farm the land, and from that, I think till this day we have most of the islands are majority kind of from the same place. Now that's in contrast to a place like Trinidad, and to a lesser extent somewhere like Jamaica. And in Trinidad, what happened is that the islands, they all had different times at which they emancipated the slaves, and a lot of that actually happened way before the slaves were emancipated in the
United States
territories. And in Trinidad, that actually occurred relatively early. I don't actually remember the early dates, but what happened in Trinidad, though, is that after the slaves got emancipated and realized that working for no money was no longer in their best interest, they still had quite a bit of work to be done, and so what they did is a second form of effective slavery. They called it indentured servitude, but it was effectively peoples now from China and from East India who were bought in as nominally slaves, called indentured servants. But then the most amazing thing happened in Trinidad, in that you ended up getting this incredible, just really almost 1/3 sort of East Indian, 1/3 sort of Black Africans, 1/3.
That's the population distribution?
And it's really just incredible.
Wow, it's so diverse. Wow.
And it's some of the most exotic and interesting and beautiful people that you'll ever encounter are from Trinidad, and it's because of this really, really amazing mix and blend. And that goes beyond just the people, and that's the culture now. That's the food, and you talked about that earlier.
Yeah.
Where there are versions of curry that in Trinidad that is so distinct from the Indian
you can't find that anywhere else,
and it's amazing. It's extraordinarily amazing, and so that goes culture and food. And,
did you travel there when you were younger?
Quite a bit, yeah. I spent quite a bit of time there. In fact, it's sort of Grenada was back then kind of known as, there are two islands in Trinidad and Tobago, and Grenada was purported to be like the third island. There was so much exchange of peoples between them. So I have quite a few family members who are in Trinidad.
What got you attracted to science when you were growing up in Grenada?
So in most of the English-speaking Caribbean islands, we still operated under sort of the British system for all, because the islands were not liberated until, at varying degrees. Grenada was in, I want to say, 74, 75. So relatively late. So all of the traditions from the English, who sort of, in their different colonies, established civil service institutions, in some cases, did a lot of infrastructure development, not so much in Grenada, but in other places did a lot of infrastructure development. And there was a lot of systems that were set up that effectively made the colonies self-governing and relatively efficient, I would say.
Nice.
So a relic of that, or at least part of that, is the education system that I grew up in and learned. And it's based on sort of primary and secondary school as opposed to the U.S. system.
Yeah.
But there was a strong emphasis very early on science.
Nice.
So I was learning chemistry in what would be the equivalent of 8th grade.
Okay. Cool.
Kind of just not just superficial chemistry, like chemistry as a real discipline, and learning about that, and physics, and it turns out that I was good at that.
Awesome.
I mean, the truth is, what got me interested in it, I was
good at it.
Yeah. It sort of my brain.
I get rewarded if I keep doing this.
It's just why my brain worked. I mean, I was mentioning earlier in that I was and still am terrible at languages. So I just couldn't make those kinds of connections. And I realized early on that I was pretty good at figuring things out. I was always, the sort of kid that was always trying to kind of tinker around and poke underneath the hood, and so I was much more interested at an early age of, if you will, deriving the answer than remembering it. And again, part of that was survival. I mean, I just have a terrible memory. If asked me to remember complex reactions, etc., I just couldn't do it. But I knew that if I could kind of maybe understand fundamentally how these things work, then I could derive sort of these reactions. And
awesome. Cool.
So that kind of pushed me more into the mathematical side of things, I would say. And I did well. I just did well at that. And I don't know if there is anything more to it than that. I mean, it's not a common thing, I would say. Growing up, the expectation was that if you were going to be successful, at least my horizons back then, as success was defined as whether or not I got to be a teller in a bank. That was, for me, if I could be a teller in a bank, I would have made it. This was my horizon.
You're not quite a teller in a bank.
Not quite. And so that's kind of, I think there were these early, insofar as there was any kind of press clippings of me, but the early ones are, me saying that I want to, be, every kid wants to be a fireman and stuff like that. But really what I wanted to be was a bank teller, because I thought that, this is going to be, this is the pathway to a good life.
Cool.
And for some people it is, but my dad, it turns out, and this happens quite a lot, in particular in Grenada, that if you look at the population for the last 40 years, it's pretty much stayed constant. And so how could that be?
That is an interesting question.
And to this day, there's actually more Grenadians, people who were born in Grenada, living outside of the island than in the island. So migration and brain drain. This is the reality of what happened, and that happened with my mom. That happened with my dad. They both left to come to the States. My dad, in particular, came and he got a scholarship from the government. He was extremely talented academically.
Wow,
very, very gifted, and got a scholarship to come to Texas, effectively. And so he went to Texas Southern University, historically black college there.
Oof,
and,
I'm jealous already.
And did TSU, man. He did all of the bands and all of that
cool
stuff. And but part of the deal was that after he got his degree, he had to come back and work a certain years in the island to kind of pay back his loan, as it were. That is a fraught decision, but he eventually came back, and he brought back with him all of his college textbooks, and in particular, he brought back his sort of literature textbooks, and so I read all of those in one night or something.
Wow.
And I was just fascinated that in anything that he was doing, because he wasn't. So I grew up with my grandparents, my paternal grandparents, or grandmother rather.
Yeah.
And she just held him in such, he was the golden child in her eyes. He's sort of, and so I was also just in awe of him, less of as a father and more of just a person. So when he came back,
wow, that's wonderful to have a role model like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because it's sort of our relationship is a lot different now, but back then that's what it was. And so I ended up, when he came back, I just grabbed onto anything that he had. And so again, I read all of his literature books. There was this one on Jonathan Livingston Seagull.
Oh man,
that I
what's that one about? I've heard that name before.
Yeah, it's just Seagull who realizes that he was different.
Oh yeah.
But it was like a coming of age if you were a seagull.
Okay, cool.
But then it turns out that he has this extraordinary ability as well, and kind of coming into your own and recognizing your own potentials, etc.
So he went back. So he went to university,
and then came back to the island. Working a civil servant job, kind of thing. Okay. Not quite a bank teller, but in the audit department for the government. But he majored in computer science, and my first experience with a computer is my dad bringing one home and telling me explicitly that I should not work on it, but knowing that by telling me that he was guaranteeing that I
would. It's like he's in a paradox already. He's like, what do I do?
But I think he wanted me to kind of explore and be unconstrained, basically.
Wait, then why didn't you say have at it?
Because he knew that the mischievous child that he had was much more likely to be exploratory if I thought that it was sneaky.
He saw the lines. He's playing
knew
chess.
It. He knew it. Yeah, there's 4-dimensional chess. So he had a lot of computer science textbooks. So I learned all about computer algorithms. I learned all about sort of basics of coding by just reading his books. And I was I didn't get most of it, but I got enough of it to then sort of apply that knowledge to the computer. And so he had, one sort of first experience was just me typing commands on the computer and being quite amused that this computer was responding with invalid syntax. I was like, you are a machine. How dare you?
You obey me.
So
man.
So like one of the
flash forward.
Yeah, well, just one of the great early sort of successes was me figuring out a sequence of commands to not get it to say invalid commands.
Wow.
So I could mess around with it. And so I was hooked, man. I was like, oh wow, this is incredible. And then I started coding. I was 10, 11 years old.
10, 11?
And
Man.
and the
I don't even know if I was potty trained at 10 or 11.
Well, the other thing that was really cool is that there was this, he started teaching me, or at least I started kind of becoming pretty decent at writing computer code. And there are all of these kind of really old languages like Fortran, and I kind of learned
Fortran.
Yeah, it's before your time.
Dang.
It's the backbone of scientific computing.
Okay.
It's this amazing language.
I mean, I only know it as like a Reddit, an underground
Reddit.
Yeah,
it's amazing. And so I learned all about that, and I was writing codes to do what eventually I didn't know at the time, but I was implementing things like trapezoid rules to doing integrals and all that stuff. So I was writing code to
trapezoid rules.
Yeah.
Wow. I actually know what you're talking about.
To do integrals and so forth. So I was fascinated. I was able to do this, and then my dad says, there's this programming language called Pascal, right? That you absolutely have to learn just because, this is what you seem interested in. So I learned Pascal and COBOL and learned about database and setting up databases and all of that stuff. And I become really, really good at that stuff. And through effectively secondary school / high school, this is kind of what's my side hustle. I was doing this on the side.
Hustling. Hustling implies there's some cash.
Well,
involved.
Okay, so maybe hustling is a bit ambitious. Slight passion, probably. I wasn't getting paid to do all this stuff. But he would have these. He's working in the audit department, but there was just starting to get computers in there as well. And so there were these computer programs that he would have to write, and I didn't help. I mean, again, I was not that good, but at least he let me see the code, and I could kind of play around with that as well. And so that was I started thinking, actually, I'm good at this. I'm pretty good at this. As I was using it to help me with math and numerical differentiations and numerical integrals, and I was able to code that all up. And so it's like, okay, so there might be a future.
There's something here.
There might be something interesting.
Yeah, you didn't. It was mostly passion. I'm sure at that age you weren't thinking about like how big of an industry it would be.
I still at that point I still thought that my horizons was a
bank teller. Like, hey, these computers are pretty cool. Well, figured out how to run this syntax. Oh, they were in the bank.
The banks are starting to use them now.
Okay,
so
cool.
This was my conduit to landing my dream job.
Awesome. Wait, so I have to know. You learned the language Pascal? Mm-hmm. And the reason you learned it wasn't because, your last name?
No, not really. I mean, it started off, of course, just kind of tongue in cheek, like, hey, you should learn it. Blaise Pascal might have been your grandfather. He was not.
Wait,
just kind of tongue in cheek kind of thing.
Okay.
But no, I learned it because I computer logic was always quite interesting to me because it's something that I got and that I could learn. I realized I could just, once I learned one language,
just keep going.
Just keep going. I was just learning a whole bunch of them, and this was something I could not do with human languages.
What?
So
no way.
Yeah,
you can
so-
if you were doing it at age 10, then human language is.
It was not. Except it was exactly the opposite. I mean, again, I tried. It was not for want of trying. Like I took 4 years of Spanish, and I'm still terrible.
Okay, cool. Well, I mean, I was thinking that earlier today, I was thinking, your fate, or your destiny as a black scientist was sealed when your last name was Pascal.
Maybe.
It was sealed. Like
great mathematician.
Yeah.
And as well, and so. Maybe I don't know. I think obviously I have tons of cousins.
Yeah. True.
Who are about as far from that as you can get. But again, it's whether it is sort of just the sheer randomness of existence or not. It's just
hard to say.
My brain works that way.
Cool. You were at Caltech for a bit, and I was just talking with one of my friends who's also a graduate student there. He's doing synthetic biology, and he says, the diversity isn't too hot at Caltech. It's not a very diverse place. And he... Ethnically, yeah. That's what I meant. Thanks for that. So how was your experience there?
Caltech is a special place. And just about anyone you ask who've gone there for grad school, and that's probably word for word what they're going to say start. I sort of had an interesting experience. I had a core group of friends who were pretty diverse, I would say.
Nice.
One of them now is now a professor there,
cool.
David Van Valen. We had a really, we're in LA, Pasadena. But
LA, Pasadena.
So we actually had a great time at it.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
I had the really good fortune of getting into the lab of Bill Goddard, who was my PhD advisor, one of the great sort of minds in computational theoretical chemistry, if you will, and kind of applied material science, computational material science. He's sort of does everything, and is still incredibly productive.
Wow.
He's 86 or something.
86, man. Yo.
But that's something that Caltech does. Like Rudy Marcus, who supposedly comes to campus every now and then, and he's 100. And sort of the again, he's
brain's built different.
It's you're just different. Like I say, it's a special place. And so my experience was extraordinarily good there. I had an amazing experience. I sort of living in a big city really for the first time in my life. Really enjoying kind of being in a place where the external world did not exist. And all that matters was the science that's happening at a sort of campus level, but even more localized than that, in your group or in your own research. I mean, this is it, man. So it's intense, but you have everyone who's doing that all the time. It's sort of. And it can become a little bit overwhelming, and I can see why. A lot of people,
they cannot hang with that.
Yeah, it just. But again, it's not.
It's not for everyone too.
It's not for everyone, but it was for me.
That's awesome,
and it worked.
I'm so happy you found that space.
It's amazing.
Yeah, that really is amazing.
Really amazing place.
Of like-minded individuals, all really passionate
and super passionate, but also, and you don't hear this a lot. But one of the main things that Bill taught me, of the many things that he taught me, but one of the amazing things was you do good science and then everything else figures itself out. And so the fundamental thing, the only thing you really should concern yourself with is just doing good science. That's it.
Wow.
In his mind, it's very, very simple.
Yeah.
Just do good science. And, so, I was always worried, what happens next? He's like, maybe at another place, people would look at this and it's like, what planet are you living in? And it's like, so then you develop, I would say, a deep appreciation for the joys of discovery, the joys of, it brings with it a certain humility. At least to me, it was the more I started, exploring one particular topic and kind of getting deeper into it, which you necessarily have to do, the more you realize just how much there is to learn, and that centers you and humbles you quite a bit.
Yeah.
But also what's really humbling and awe-inspiring is when you start looking back at what we and the proverbial, the larger we here as a species, not just even scientists, but just a species has figured out, even in these super complex things. And areas. Then you realize that like humans, we're all right. We're all right. And so that's motivating.
Yeah,
it's
that is
like,
motivating.
All of the people that came before me from different backgrounds, again, not quite as diverse as we'd like, but we're working on that.
We're working on it.
Have kind of dedicated, in some cases, their lives to figuring certain stuff out, and have come up with these really beautiful solutions that are super elegant, and
we stand on their shoulders.
More than that, we are incredibly indebted to them, and I try not to make it seem as this completely romantic idea, but there is a little bit of romanticism in it that says that you sort of participate in it for a large part for the pursuit of knowledge and and the sake of acquiring knowledge and kind of furthering it. I mean, again, we're humans, and so there are ulterior motives. I want to win awards, and I want to be famous, and
you want to put some food on your plate.
To a lesser extent.
Yeah.
I want to sleep. So not only are we standing on their shoulders, we're sort of all in this huge, really, really beautiful opera that extends back hundreds of years, and we're the latest stage actors that are participating in it, and so it's all the more glorious for that reason, I think.
Wow, I'm impressed if you can keep that in your mind when you're working on something that what I feel like is as far away from that as possible. When you're trying to figure out like the electronic structure of that molybdenum complex that you're working with, for me, I'd kind of struggle to think about all the beauty of what's happening in the past.
Yeah.
So I read these papers you sent me, or read as much of them as I could.
Yeah.
I want to talk first about the one involving that molybdenum disulfide compound. As a disclaimer, this is not my expertise at all, which I'm kind of honestly a little bit sad because I've taken a molecular dynamics class.
Yeah.
I've taken a NanoEngineering class, and those were like 2 out of the 4 tags on that article. But still, a lot of it went over my head. Regardless, I want to know, what is this molybdenum disulfide?
Right.
And how do you envision that whole work impacting carbon dioxide reduction?
Yeah. Okay, so maybe we could start from there, right? And which is a statement of the problem. And of course, the statement of the problem is obvious in the sense that there is more CO2 in the atmosphere than is conducive to us as humans now having a future on this planet, right? So it is true that there have been times in the past that had more CO2 than we're approaching.
Yeah.
But those times in the past also did not have any life.
Yes.
So, all right. So if you want to argue,
just lay it all out. There was no life, folks.
So that's, if you want to argue that, things have been worse in the past, yes. But being worse in the past came with the prescription that there was no life.
There was no life.
So we're headed towards uncertain future. Actually, no, it's quite certain, but a pretty dark future, I would say. At least as it relates to our continued existence on this planet. But I'm optimistic, and I think necessarily to be alive, at least nominally participating in this, this dance that is life, one needs to be optimistic.
Oh yeah.
So I'm optimistic because I think my optimism stems not just from a recognition that, as a species, again, we're doing all right. We've come from trying to not get eaten in the Serengeti and then starting to look up and thinking, so that was pretty precarious times.
We've come real far.
there were times where there probably was like a few thousand of us on this planet, and so it was really, really precarious times. And then, we sort of started looking up in the stars and sort of imagining using our brains to do something much more than just survive. We started
we're like, hey, how can we plan for the next summer's harvest,
for example,
by looking at the stars?
That's still a little bit of survival instinct. What I was thinking is, we looked up there and we started imagining what potentially created all of this, and that, at least to me, that has very little to do with surviving on a day-to-day basis. That was the first kind of hallucinations, if you will, that kind of gave rise to sort of some sort of creativity to start thinking about, there is this, something is out there. Maybe there is something within us to start interacting with that, in the case, nature. And
you're right, it's like we looked down for survival and we looked up.
Yeah. It just was like for
inspiration,
and from that creativity comes, and we get everything. We get the arts and all of that, but we also get science from that.
We looked up and our prehistoric ancestors were thinking, oh, there's a lot of carbon dioxide there. This could be a problem in the future.
It's like 2 parts per billion. And so it becomes this issue, this existential crisis, as it were, as to how do we deal with that? We're doing all right, but we've also made some really poor decisions, at least most recently, and that, a lot of that is centered around our need now to produce energy from burning fossil fuels, and that has the bad side effect of increasing the CO2 in the atmosphere. Okay, so how do we do it, and what leads to optimism? So there are these compounds that we can, at least materials, and our lab focuses a lot on material science, materials chemistry, materials physics. So how can we develop new materials that can start addressing some of our fundamental challenges? Or how could we change existing materials to actually give them,
one or the other,
give them new life, as it were. And so these compounds, these molybdenum chalcogenides, basically, so sulfur.
How do you pronounce it?
Chalcogenides.
Chalcogenides. Yeah. That's a mouthful.
So it's just the sulfur row, right? So sulfur, selenium, and all of that.
Cool.
Just go down. They turn out that they are really good at actually grabbing onto CO2 and converting it into other compounds, some of which can be quite useful for us, like formates and formic acids and so forth. So they do that, though.
CO2 to formate.
Yeah, so they do that. So in order to do that, there's a series of chemical reactions that have to happen. And the name of the game then is, okay, can we start engineering materials that have just the right energy, so they grab onto it with the right amount of strength, they sort of facilitate these complex reactions so that we can start forming things that we can use
that are useful
basis. And so our interest in that particular work was, how do we understand, basically? So the other part of that is that these reactions are, the rate at which they proceed is extremely sensitive to the potential that you apply. So these are
potential.
Right. So these are what I call electrocatalysis, meaning that you need to provide some driving force in the.
It's not going to happen spontaneously.
Exactly. Right.
So you need
to provide some amount of energy in the form of electrons in order to get this thing to really go really fast. And so so then that starts merging a lot of things that we are super interested in, which is kind of fundamental questions. So you have a surface, a metallic surface, a semiconducting surface, and you start pumping electrons into it. Like, what really happens there? Like, how does the pumping electrons into this change reaction rates and change reaction barriers? And so we're really, really interested in kind of understanding that from a fundamental kind of we are electrons kind of perspective.
Okay.
And so developing the computational and theoretical tools to kind of look at those systems becomes really, really challenging and really interesting.
Yes.
So in this particular project, we sort of developed those tools to kind of look at those reactions. And then we say, okay, fine. How can we make a connection between the things we're doing on the computer and the simulations we're running and the calculations we're doing and the actual real experiment? And so because of the complexity of a lot of these calculations, it means that we can only work on systems that are relatively small. So nanoscale systems. Well, it turns out that experiments now are able to make nanoscale versions of these materials, which is what happened in this particular case.
Awesome.
And so we're at the same length scales, and it's like, great. So then the next thing is, all right, how do we have a probe that is accessible experimentally that we can also simulate on the computer?
It's got to be light, right?
So then another part of our lab is, how does light interact with matter?
Yeah.
And so we simulate sort of light interacting with matter quite a bit, and that forms for us now this necessary one-to-one connection to the experiments. And we like to say, for instance, that if you're modeling, you're developing theories, then it's possible and usually quite likely that you're getting the right answer for the wrong reasons, i.e. you get lucky.
The right answer for the
wrong reasons. And this is not even in like a, the bachelor or bachelorette for the right reasons type sort of thing. This is, just because we are, for various reasons, and usually related to just the mystery, if you will, of electrons, that we haven't yet come up with as a species a way of describing those electrons exactly. So we have to make approximations to make our lives feasible, to make these calculations possible. Some approximations are better than others, and sometimes we have what we think is a good approximation, but it's because effectively we have a huge cancellation of error. So we make an error in one part and then a negative error, if you will, in another, and together they kind of give you the right answer. And so that's the right answer for the wrong reason. But spectroscopy, which is effectively the response of a material to absorption of light, is one of those places that you can't hide. Like, you can't get the right answer. You can't
run away from spectroscopy.
You can't get the right answer for the wrong reasons. And so that then allows you to say, okay, if this is the experiment and this is the theory, and I put them on top of each other and they match, it means not only do I have the right model, but I also have the right level of theory that faithfully represents the experiment. And so we do a lot of that in our lab as well. And so that's what we did in this particular case. In that we developed these methods that allowed us to actually uncover the mechanism by which CO2 comes on these nanomaterials and gets converted into useful products. And so we're able to map that out using effectively computational spectroscopy.
Okay. And when you say mechanism, my brain is thinking OChem arrow pushing mechanism.
Yeah.
Would you say this is like
similar to that?
Okay. Because when we talk about nanomaterials, the mechanisms, they get a little bit, I think they're a little different.
They get different, but in a predictable way, I would say.
Okay, cool.
And so figuring out sort of how reaction barriers and reaction pathways evolve and how they're different at the nanoscale than the macro scale, I would say, is one of the great opportunities now to do a new kind of engineering to kind of help get over a lot of the problems that we're having.
The difference in mechanism between macro scale and micro scale, and that's what your research is focused on, the micro scale, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay.
So how can we, how can we understand why we have differences? If we do have differences, how can we understand that? But also, how can we then manipulate that to to solve problems that we may not be able to, that we have not been able to solve.
Like carbon capture.
Carbon conversion.
Carbon conversion. Okay, sweet. The other article you sent me on is about something that pertains to another hot topic.
Yeah.
I mean, and this was probing lithium ion mobility in solid electrolytes.
Yeah.
This one was really cool
Yeah.
because right now I'm studying for my ACS exams, okay? And I'm going over the dreadful electrochemistry. I say dreadful because there's a lot of memorization involved.
Yeah.
Things are moving in circles. We got a lot of names. Most people, when they think of a battery, they know an electrolyte is probably a solution. But you're working with solid electrolytes. So what are those, and how did you measure them, and what research were you doing on them?
I think you're right when people think about, insofar as most people have had an experience with a battery, at least in the old days. If you my dad loves old cars, and it's something that I was never very good at, but I had uncles who were grease monkeys, and they were always tinkering around to this day. Really tinkering around with old cars. And so I remember the old kind of lead sulfur batteries, or sulfuric acid batteries rather.
They had those? I didn't even know that.
Oh yeah. And
Sulfuric acid?
Oh yeah.
Whew.
Those are
That's bad.
Really, really bad
Oh
stuff.
man.
Like,
You can probably smell them.
You smell them, but also, I mean, they're super corrosive.
Yeah.
And so you have to be super careful. But so I always remembered, my uncles would be telling me that this is, everything else you can they'll let me do. But whenever you're working on the bat, it's like, no, this can give you some serious chemical burns.
Wow.
Your parents are going to kill me if something happens to you because of this battery. So you develop an appreciation for that. But it's because of this sulfuric acid, this sort of liquid. And when, Professor John Goodenough, who recently won a Nobel Prize for lithium-ion batteries, when he was sort of thinking about...
recently? How recent?
2 years ago, maybe.
Okay.
Even. Was thinking about those systems, it was natural then that the electrolyte... So to be clear, a battery basically has a place that has the charge carrier. Modern batteries are based on lithium, but it doesn't necessarily have to be lithium. It can be any ion. Lithium just because it's light and it is able to move easily. So you get good currents out of it. The place that has the lithium, and the lithium, or the ion as it were, the charge carrier, is united with the electrons. And then there's the electrolyte where the ion can move through, but the electrons cannot. The ions move through the electrolyte, they follow a chemical potential, so they're sort of happier at the other end.
At the other end, yeah.
And so the electrons, of course, are happy with the ions.
Yeah, with the ion coming.
And so they move, they try to move, they can't get through the electrolyte. So what do? They move in the external circuit.
Yeah.
So you get a flow of electrons, you get current, and you can do useful work. All right. So that's a battery. So the electrolyte then becomes the separator, this place of effectively divorcing the coupling of the lithium or the ion with its electron. So that's its role, to act as a judge or a lawyer, effectively, to dissolve that marriage, if you will. Okay. And but then they recombine later. So it's
a Western society. There's lots of divorce.
So they recombine later. So
it's still a happy ending.
It's still happy.
Lovely.
So then the question becomes, okay, how do we develop, more and more effective electrolytes, right? Because you do have they break down sometimes, and then you have bad things that are happening. And
how do they break down? You said in the article dendrite. I'm like, what's that?
So the lithium is leaving sort of one part of it and it's traveling to the other part, basically. Most of the times, it's happy doing that as a free agent, as an isolated particle. But sometimes it actually finds that there is a pathway to do that where it can recruit other lithiums with it. And so you get these little hairs, effectively, these little fingers, if you will, that start growing, which is effectively the lithium moving back and forth, and it's coming back and it's depositing on these areas, and it's kind of growing these little needle-like structures.
And is it growing? Is it depositing on the cathode?
Yeah,
it's cathode of the
exactly.
electrode,
yeah, and it's sort of depositing on the cathode and coming out.
Okay.
And then, but if it keeps doing that, then you make a connection between the two electrodes. Now.
Oh, that's no good.
That's no good because now electrons can go.
Yeah,
back
now
and
electrons
forth,
can go
and
through.
And then you get shorted
because it's solid.
Exactly. So it's a conductive material.
It's a conductive material.
So it punctures your electrolyte and it sort of makes this wire, if you will.
In
the center of your battery. That then is easier for the electrons to go through the external circuit, and then the electrons do that, and you generate a lot of heat that way, and then the battery shorts, and you get catastrophic failure. Basically, of the battery.
So that wouldn't happen if it was a solid electrolyte.
It's harder to see how that would happen.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine it.
So that's it has been the hype for solid. Now, very few times in life do you get something for free. Except if you're a grad student and you show up to seminar talks, you get free food for doing that. But
seminar talks.
But so what you get is kind of safety. You sort of usually pay in terms of the speed at which the lithium can go from one electrode to another. Because remember, the faster the lithium gets from one side to the other, the faster the electrons move across the external circuit. So that the larger the current,
the larger the current. Yeah.
So in solid states, the way that the lithium gets through the solid is different than how it gets through in the liquid. And so in the liquid, it gets through much, much, much faster.
Okay.
Much, much, much faster. And so that's why your iPhone and your car batteries and your EV batteries are all liquid based because you need a good current.
You need that current.
But now it turns out that there are these new sort of solid state materials that are called solid state ion conductors that are starting to approach actually based on their conductivity of the liquid based on their nano architecture. So you can create them, or at least they have some intrinsic structure at the nanoscale that allows the ions to move really, really rapidly through them. And one of those materials is the one that we looked at in this paper, the so-called lithium, lanthanum, titanium oxide.
Lithium, lanthanum, titanium oxide. It's always a mouthful.
It's called LLTO, but it's one of these now new classes of solid state electrolytes that people are extremely excited about. So that we were really interested in understanding how lithium gets through this material.
How does it move through this solid?
Exactly. So we think we have a pretty decent idea as how it moves through the bulk, but then the rub for solid state materials, at least solid state batteries.
The rub?
The rub meaning the reason that you don't have one now in your phone, or the reason that you don't have one in your car, is that even if you get one with a good electrolyte where it can move through the bulk of the material very, very quickly, the question is what happens at the interface between sort of one solid, your electrolyte, and another solid, let's say, which is your electrode. So those have to be, we think, perfectly commensurate with each other, or else you get sort of these mismatches that forces the lithium to go through different pathways and slows it down. So
then it's not going to have any current pretty much.
Right. So, or you keep cycling, and then the good pathways start getting blocked because of this incommensurate. Because, batteries, believe it or not, are dynamic creatures in the sense that we like to think of them as you have an electrode and an electrolyte. The electrolyte might be liquid, and so it's moving, but the electrode is static. No, it's sort of growing and dying and all the time, and it's changing its morphology, it's changing its structure,
mass is getting positive.
Yeah, things are moving back and forth.
We charge it up.
Exactly. And so similar things happen and the solid state batteries as well. They're sort of moving, and where the definition, if you will, between electrode and electrolyte changes all the time.
Completely,
lines get blurred. And so things are pretty dynamic. And so you can get clogging of pores, if you will, and that just like in your sink or your bathroom, when that happens, then everything slows down, and you need to figure out a way forward. For a long time in the field, the assumption was that the reason that you get these really slow overall performances was because the two solids are next to each other and then they're not exactly in sync. So that it becomes a kind of traditional materials and metallurgy kind of challenge. Like, how do you make that interface as commensurate as possible? And so that has been primarily the way people have been proposing to solve this problem. Like, okay, we just need better way of milling these two things together to do that. But it's really difficult, though, to actually understand what's happening right at the interface, right? Because you have
nanometer scale.
The interface might be nanometer, but on top of that, you have microns or even more of bulk material. And so even if you have a technique like, NMR or IR or, whatever, Raman, that can tell you about what's happening at the micro scale, that signal gets dominated by the bulk components of it. And so it's really, really hard, even for those techniques that we know about, to actually look at the interface without ripping one part of it off and then looking at it with a microscope, which, we do, but out of necessity, because we just don't have any good way of having the two materials together and just focusing on it, the interface. And so what we've been working with an experimental group, Michael Zurich at UC Berkeley, working on is
shout out UC Berkeley,
developing and Craig Schwartz, I should also point out, who's at UNLV. They had the idea, working with another professor at UC Berkeley, Rich Sakeley, that maybe what we can do is develop a spectroscopic technique that was very, very sensitive to interfaces. So even if you have microns of material, that it would actually tell you what is happening right at the interface. And so that then combines two kinds of spectroscopies, both involving X-rays, but X-rays that can penetrate deep into a material. And so we've known how to do that for a long time. That's so-called X-ray absorption spectroscopy. It's bulk sensitive. And then another one called second harmonic generation, or some frequency generation, which is an interfacially sensitive technique. And so we've managed to marry those two together and develop this approach that gives you the advantages of both worlds. It allows you to penetrate deep into a material, but it only gives you a signal at the interface. And so we're able to use that to
That's counterintuitive.
Yeah, look at...
to recognize the interface? Or to give you a signal only at the interface?
And it does that, because of the math. You work out basically, what is required to actually get this particular signal. And it turns out you can only get that particular signal where you have broken symmetry. So, and where does broken symmetry occur? Right at
the interface.
So you get a signal. So second harmonic generation, subfrequency generation, is a technique developed by another Berkeley professor, Ron Shen, and it's been used for a long time now to look at air-water interfaces. So not using X-rays, but using visible light. And so this now is to sort of, again, marry both of those worlds to say, actually, we have this really robust way of looking at interfaces, but it's been relegated to looking at things with vacuums above it because of the energy of the that we've been using to probe the system. So now we're going to take that and put it with X-rays, and in order to look at interfaces. To make that happen, because effectively it's what is called a second-order process, or a nonlinear process. So normally you get photons or light comes in, electrons absorb it, they get excited. And then
we lit, fellas. and then some time passes.
And then they say, we can't live in this excited state forever, so we return to where we were. But energy has to be conserved, and so they give off the energy that they absorbed, and that comes off as a X-ray photon that you can then detect.
Sweet.
It turns out that it effectively only does that for very specific energies.
Yes.
That is related more or less to the electronic structure of the system, meaning that you have electrons and they're in specific orbitals, and those orbitals have different energy spacings between them.
Yep.
And so the electron then kind of goes into an excited state and the only way in which it can do that is if the incoming energy
radiation,
exactly matches the spacings between those energy levels.
Okay.
And And so that spacing is element specific. So carbon happens at about 250 electron volts. These are huge and biases, by the way. Think of a battery, which is 3 volts, and you need about 100 of those stacked on top of each other, basically, to sort of get the energy range that the voltage that you need to rip an electron out of carbon. And so it sort of becomes these really high energy X-rays, and we can only generate that typically. You could do these for certain materials. You can buy a benchtop X-ray source and do higher harmonics. For these kinds of experiments, you need to go to a synchrotron, a sort of an X-ray facility, and there's one in Berkeley, there's one in Stanford.
You need a specialized facility with very, very high energy X-rays.
High energy X-rays, and so the additional complication. So that's X-ray absorption spectroscopy, and we've been doing this for a while now to tell us what's in the bulk of the material.
Cool.
The additional complication with second harmonic generation, this interfacially sensitive version of it, is that you effectively need that absorption process to happen twice. So the same electron needs to absorb one photon and then absorb another photon. And so the chances of you hitting that same electron with 2 individual photons is exceedingly rare.
How would that even?
It's really, really rare. And so to maximize your chances of actually doing that, you need a tightly focused beam. You need a tightly focused beam. Such that you need a laser, effectively. That is highly coherent. And so you need a
really tiny one.
Yeah, a very small
very
spot size,
one,
but also in energy space, it can't be spread out very much. You need a very tight energy window as well.
But it's also very high energy.
And very high energy. So you need a special machine.
The needs are.
And so those are called free electron lasers. And
free electron lasers.
So the ones that occur at X-ray frequencies, there are only a couple in the world. We did this one at Sakura in Japan. And that was, so I attended, even though, we did the computations, I went along for that one.
Hey,
so I'm like,
awesome.
We go to, we flew into Osaka, we took the bullet train out.
Wow.
And on the way back, we stopped off at Kobe in Japan. And
Kobe, is that
like Kobe beef?
Oh, is it a city?
Yeah.
I didn't even know that. I thought it was just the food.
No, we stopped out there and we had an incredible experience just eating there, which is amazing. So we did this experiment and we got a signal. And we're pretty sure that the signal was coming just from the interface of this material. But we didn't know for sure. And so our group then decided that we're going to simulate the spectra that one should see from
this real experiment.
This experiment. And then it turns out that, the match was extraordinarily good. In fact, it was suspiciously good. And if we hadn't done it, I would have been very skeptical that these calculations actually were that good. It was amazing.
It must have been a very nice, pleasant surprise.
It was a pleasant surprise, but I think it actually, it should not have been so good. And so then the next step is we were trying to understand why is it so good. Yeah.
Wow.
We thought we had a good theory, and it turns out that
just
we did.
Let that simmer for a second. You traveled to Japan to use one of 5 instruments that exist in the world.
Yeah.
You got a result that matched so perfectly that you had to just understand why it matched perfectly, and you were just skeptical.
Well, I think part of being alive, if part of being alive is to be optimistic, part of being a scientist is to be skeptical. You have to, even especially probably of your own results. And we knew that we did the theory as good as we could, and so we were like, okay, well, let's now assume that, that this is real. What is it telling us? And what it was telling us is, and we knew this from previous experience doing these kinds of calculations, that this spectroscopy, this surface spectroscopy, this surface X-ray spectroscopy, SHG and X-rays, is very sensitive to very, very small fluctuations. Meaning very, very small changes in the structure at the interface. So we knew this. We had demonstrated this before in a couple publications, that if you change things by a very, very small amount, the spectra changes quite a bit. And so the question is, why were we not seeing that here? Like, how is it that we took our calculations, which were on static structures that were not moving, almost idealized surfaces, and somehow it was matching the experiments, which should, in principle, have things moving around like crazy. And it turns out that the answer to that then is because actually the lithium at the surface in this particular case is not moving around as crazy. And this is a perfect surface. So remember, we talked about the idea being that to make this material, this solid-state battery, work better, all we need to do is some milling. We need to make the interfaces perfect. We need to make these interfaces commensurate with each other.
Yeah.
But what we found out actually is that there is an inherent property of the material itself that slows down the lithium. It has little to do with incompatibility at the interface. Once the lithium gets to the interface, it slows down, and that's a property of the material itself. And so that was the finding there, that actually what's happening is all of the really cool material chemistry that you learn about surface phonons and distribution of energy and how that all works.
Yes.
And all of that conspires to actually slow down the lithium dynamics at the interface. And so that was interesting to us, because then it suggests that for this material and maybe this class of materials, we're looking into that now, that there is this resistance effectively to lithium moving through the interface that is inherent to the material itself. It's like a property of the material. And so that was...
When you say resistance, you're not talking about resistance like Ohm's law resistance.
No, well, kind of, right? So there is a resistance to it moving through the interface. So there is a slowing down, if you will, a natural slowing down that occurs. That's just a property of the interface of the system itself. And it goes beyond now. So in other words, our prediction is, even if you make the most perfect interface that is commensurate with the electrode, you would still see that the lithium is not getting through as fast as you think it should. I mean, that's because the interface itself is sort of inherently trying to trap the lithiums, if you will.
Wow.
And so that was a good result, but you sort of don't inspire too much optimism.
I was going to say, wait, we're trying to get it to move fast, right?
You then start saying that actually there's inherent, there's something in this material.
It's like you just drove him to a dead end.
Right. It's like, there's no hope for solid-state batteries. So then we were like, okay, so this is a good finding. It's sort of it helps kind of think about.
It helps guide the path forward,
And then one of the things that we think one might do now is there is actually a way to maybe speed things up at the interface by some chemical doping. And we predict basically that you should be able to activate these processes that helps get it through the bulk. You should be able to activate them at the interface or absent at the interface. Largely speaking, that you might be able to activate them by carefully engineering the interface with certain other elements.
All right.
So that's the promise. So it's not all gloom and doom.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear
there's
that.
There's a potential way forward there.
I would love to have a solid electrolyte in my phone in like 15, 20 years.
Yeah, so there are companies that are out there that are trying to commercialize this.
Oh yeah, already?
Yeah.
Okay.
Depending on if you believe these press briefings, propaganda or whatever, they're further along than
you would say.
But whatever. I mean, I think people are really working hard, and so this idea of kind of surface phonon activation, which is what we're calling it, now is a new knob to turn, or at least a new degree of freedom, a new thing to think about as to how to actually engineer these systems.
Okay, cool.
So it's pretty cool.
That's awesome. Yo. All right, so I want to transition into your last article.
Yeah.
Once again, I've taken transition metal chemistry at a graduate level. Learned about nanoengineering and these ligands that kind of went over my head.
Yeah.
So we'll start at the ground. What are nanoparticles? what other applications, the ones that you're working with? You wrote optoelectronic function and catalytic reactivity. And why do we care so much about changing their structures so much?
Right. Okay. So nanoparticles, just two words, nano and particles, right? So just very, very small systems that are usually comprised of metals, gold, silver, etc., or things like semiconducting systems. And the reason why you would want to use them is sort of, back to almost the first work we talked about, which is, at the nanoscale, you will get opportunities now that you don't have at the microscale. So you have a system where the surface now typically defines the function or the performance.
Surface defines the function.
Because it's the surface to area ratio is actually maximized at the nanoscale.
Okay.
So then if all of the reactivity or all of the catalytic activity effectively happens on the surface, then you're maximizing that at the nanoscale effectively. So it's very exciting for catalysis because it just provides a way to actually improve significally the turnover rate of your reaction because you have so many sites that are available.
Yeah, there's so much surface.
So much surface area that you can do things with. And so, but probably the way people are most familiar with nanoparticles are, in TV displays. Now,
okay.
Where you have
TV.
These
hey.
These nanoparticles that are, what are called photonic nanoparticles. So you pass a current through them and you can kind of get them to glow. And because they're sort of so small, you can get incredible resolution from them effectively, right?
Much better than what we got back here,
exactly.
right?
Yeah. So
have you ever seen a display with one of...
With a nanoparticles display? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, wow. What does it look like?
It's, Can
you even notice the difference?
Probably the human eye couldn't, but I mean...
So then what are we doing?
If you had a huge, ginormous display...
then you'd appreciate it. Yeah. Oh, that would make sense.
So and other reasons, of course, they're very efficient at sort of, converting electricity into photons. And so in principle, you could have them be low energy kind of systems as well. And so in our
low energy kind of systems,
meaning that, if using, TVs don't actually require much energy, but if you could cut that.
Says the guy running ultra high energy X-rays in Japan.
I know. I live in two worlds. But people watch a lot of TV. So even if the TV itself is not consuming a lot, you do consume.
So you're saying you can use decreased energy with a nanoparticle-based display.
Exactly.
Oh, sorry.
So that cuts effectively.
That's huge.
That's huge because
that's massive.
People do a lot of.
Oh my goodness.
And they have other reasons that you would want to do them for displays. And then, there are things that are coming on like smart windows and effectively the ability to control how much absorption of light occurs by these nanoparticles and then convert it into electrical signals. And so you can imagine a window that is nominally transparent that's absorbing some wavelengths of light and is converting that into electricity. And so you could control how much light is passing through it at the different wavelengths. So
you could actually dim and brighten.
And at the same time, you can generate electricity at the same time.
Generate electricity too?
Yeah.
And even a display? No.
Yeah. Well, usually it's just for windows.
Okay, just for windows. But that'd be awesome.
So there's
you could change the color?
Yeah.
That'd be so cool.
Some really, really cool
There's some really exciting stuff to look forward to.
So all of that is in the pipeline. And some people have startups on all of that. And so they're incredibly versatile in terms of, and it being energy efficient and as well as allowing very precise control over them. So that's why you want to control how they come together because nominally, I mean, just kind of going back to GChem or maybe PChem.
Yeah.
If you
go
have,
back.
you have this, system. Think of soap bubbles that are really, really small.
Okay.
The reason that you don't get really, really, really microscopically small surface bubbles is because the surface tension just says it's way too much energy to actually create something that's small. And the thermodynamic state is to just pop it, to just have it not do that.
Nope. That's a nice analogy.
So to do nanoparticles, then to prevent it from just dissolving away, you have to protect the surface. You have to incarcerate it. So to protect them, you have to have things that are wrapping around them. And usually we do that with some kind of polymer. We have some sort of organic polymer usually that wraps around them and protects them and keeps the integrity, structural integrity.
Awesome.
The problem is, at least the issue is that polymers do this pretty indiscriminately. They just randomly wrap around things. And so some of the nanoparticle ends up being exposed. And those exposed parts, usually attract each other, and so
and then they aggregate.
So then you get a bunch of aggregates, and so it's not so useful. Is it really a nanoparticle if you have
30 of them?
Well, or more than that, if you have huge aggregates that are forming micron-sized things, no longer nano. So you lose the nano ability from aggregation. So that's a problem. So that's why you would want to actually kind of figure out a way to separate them at an individual particle limit, as it were. And then, so we can talk about these catalytic sites as well, in that sometimes you actually don't want certain sites to be exposed because they might be catalytically active in certain media, but then you want them to be exposed in another media. So let's say they're in solution, you may not want them to be exposed. You may want the polymers to wrap around them, but of course there's no guarantee because it's a random wrapping. But then when you place them on a surface that you can then use to actually do catalysis, you may want them exposed. So the question is, how do you control where the polymer goes on the nanoparticle as a function of its environment? To enable catalysis, to
just control it.
To just control it. Yeah. And so that's what this paper is about, basically, how to actually design now specific ligands, and ligands are just small molecules that can bind onto surfaces or proteins or whatever. How can you design ligands that can go at specific parts of your nanoparticles and not other parts?
Okay.
The basic idea is you can do this by what I would call steric pressure. So you have sterically-encumbered ligands.
Yeah.
But effectively, if you think of an X-wing fighter from Star Wars, right?
Okay.
So you have this sort of, this part, you're sitting in the center, and on each end you have these kind of wings, and they form like these W shape, if you will.
Sure. Cool.
So then, if you have these structures, and if the binding is through the center, and you try to place those down, or if you place them on a flat surface, the wings get in the way.
Yeah, that's not going to work. So they'll only go to an edge.
They'll only go to an edge. So they can wrap around.
Okay. The nanoparticles bind over here in the center, but we attach these big, bulky, annoying things that are not going to allow them to bind to the nanoparticle on a flat surface, but at an edge, it can bind and prevent binding.
Exactly.
Over here too.
Exactly. So that's how you control it. So that was the general idea.
Okay, yeah. And so that's why we care about these sterically. I've been asking Josh Figueroa for years. So what's a terphenyl? What's why do we got all these benzenes on ligands?
For a lot of reasons. This is one application of them. So you mentioned Josh Figueroa. So he's been pioneering these ligands for years, for different applications. And
they have many?
Many applications, but I think in this, usually in catalysis, but I think his true genius in this instance was to recognize that this can serve as a design principle for nanoparticles as well, and so
that is very impressive.
It's really cool, and then we have
it's a totally different application.
Yeah, and then folks from the Andrea Tao's lab here at UCSD as well, who can make these things and who can
just make
these nanoparticles and
the nanoparticles, not the ligands.
So Josh's group makes the ligands. Andrew's group makes
Josh
makes the nanoparticles.
Andrew makes the nanoparticles. Shout out Andrew. I don't know you, Andrew, but
Andrea Tao.
Yeah. Oops.
And together magic happens. And so our group was charged then with understanding what is the energetics, how is this working?
Okay, cool.
Because it's a cool concept and it seems to be bearing out in the experiment. But is our intuition and is our hypothesis actually supported by theory. And it turns out that the answer to that is yes.
That's awesome.
And then the theory can help you understand how changing the chemistry now on these ligands would affect the binding. And so we have now this control basically of who goes where based on changing the chemistry. And so this is sort of the first in a series of works that we'll put out, sort of demonstrating how you can have chemical control now over the size of these particles, right? And so who binds where. And then also eventually the assembly, so how they come together to form larger structures.
What's the timeline for making these nanoparticles and cutting them off with these ligands?
Right. So basically, in order for these nanoparticles to be stable, they need something on the surface. So you need to put something on the surface first.
Okay.
And then usually what happens is you then allow them to find each other and then they assemble.
Okay.
So they can assemble and just make a agglomerate mess. Or they can assemble, you can then think about, okay, well, now I have these nanoparticles with these ligands that are only on the edges, or at least only at places of high curvature. I can attach something on the back end of these ligands to then force the particles to only effectively come on edge. So then I can start controlling the overall assembly by changing the chemistry at the back end of these sterically-encumbered groups. So I can have them click together basically by only edge on edge, because that's only where those ligands are.
And that's only where you want them to be too.
Exactly. And so then the question is, what kinds of interesting shapes
can we make?
So if you have randomly generated things that are agglomerating, it's just going to be close packed. It's going to be just indiscriminate, directionless binding. But now we have directionality that we can build in at a very fundamental level.
Wow.
So the question is, what are the possibilities here? Can we make things that are hexagonal? Can we make prisms? Pyramidal? Can we make star shapes? What can we actually do?
Yeah.
So that's the real exciting part now.
That is very exciting. I mean, the possibilities are probably limitless.
Limited by our imagination.
Yeah.
Which may or may not be a good thing. But no, so that's the real. It sort of goes into some real deep questions of sort of differential geometry and thermodynamics and kinetics, just kind of basic
and
organic computations, inorganic chemistry, and spectroscopy.
It's really a multifaceted question.
So this is, and I think this is the kinds of questions that So we have this MRSEC, this Materials Research Center here at UCSD. And these were the kind of questions that we wanted to ask and answer. Answering, hopefully, but certainly ask and be able to interrogate. And so this is one example of the kinds of things that one can do if you have people who are approaching the same problem from a different perspective, working in this sort of integrated team to kind of just explore the science. And again, this kind of Caltech-y, do science for science's sake sort of
and
thing.
You'll discover so many things.
That is now apply, say, do science for science's sake. And we expanded a little bit to say that could potentially have some applications to solving real world problems.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. That was great. I am so thrilled to learn about your research, learn about your past, learn about the future. And man, I really would love to have you back on this in the future.
Sure, anytime. Thanks for having me.
We
have there are other things that we're interested in. But other people are doing other things as well. So we're just excited about, and UCSD fosters this quite well, I think, just sort of being in a place where one can ask, elementary questions, and elementary not in the sense that they're easily answered, but elementary in the sense that they're basic questions that we need to ask before we start even thinking about larger issues or larger questions. And we've been afforded that luxury. We've come at it from a kind of a theory and computation, but we've also been extremely fortunate to have people on campus who come at it from different perspectives, and also people from other universities, and as you can see, other countries as well who
Yeah.
are also involved in sort of the scientific enterprise. And so on we go.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tod.